like to start the program on time, and since it is 7 o'clock, let me introduce myself and welcome you all here. My name is Matt Brooks, and I am delighted to be here because this is truly an extraordinary panel at an extraordinary time. All of the folks that you'll hear from tonight are... Is the mic not on? Oh. How about now? Okay. So all the folks that you'll hear from tonight are all exceptional thinkers and speakers, and I'm sure that this evening's program will be both thought-provoking and entertaining at the same time. Before I introduce our moderator, I do have one clarification to make. Some of you know me not just through the Jewish Policy Center, but also through the Republican Jewish Coalition. The RJC, thank you. Worthy of a clap. The RJC is our sister organization, but is wholly separate. The JPC, which is hosting this event here this evening, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization which brings its own unique brand of policy analysis to the Jewish community. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the JPC, the organization, the think tank supports very strongly Israel in her quest for legitimacy and security in the Middle East. The JPC advocates for a strong American defense capability, cooperating closely with Israel and other allied countries. We believe in fiscal responsibility. We believe in energy security and less reliance on Middle East sources of energy, and we also believe in free speech and intellectual diversity. We think those are nonpartisan positions. At your seat this evening, you all have copies of our quarterly magazine, JPC's in Focus. I encourage all of you to take it home this evening and to read it. It is, I think, very intellectually thought-provoking and stimulating. Those of you who are interested in making a financial contribution to help us continue our programs and educational efforts in the Jewish community, such as today's Policy Forum, our In Focus magazine, and our expanded and upgraded online capabilities, you can make that contribution using the contribution envelopes that are conveniently located in the magazine. The JPC also publishes articles and opinion pieces in the press and online. We send speakers to synagogues, churches, universities, civic groups, all across the country. We supply expert information to other organizations working to support Israel and the U.S.-Israel security cooperation in many fields. Now, tonight's forum concerns what is on a lot of our mind. It concerns America's foreign policy priorities, specifically the current upheaval in the Middle East, what is happening, why, and how the U.S. can make effective policy to punish our enemies and protect our friends and allies. This should engender some discussion of who in the Middle East deserves the real title of America's ally. Now, a modest mandate for our speakers is that very topic. And America's historic role as a superpower doesn't permit us to retreat into what used to be an isolated position surrounded by water and mostly friendly neighbors. We still have to maximize our credibility and our influence abroad. How well or how poorly we're doing will be an ongoing theme here this evening. Now, before we begin, we've got three housekeeping items that I've been asked to pass along. First, for those of you who have to leave the program early, and I hope none of you have to do that, or to use the restroom, please exit through the back doors, back there, as opposed to the doors you came in through here. We have volunteers that will help you, direct you back there. Please, please, please turn off your cell phones, or at least turn it on to vibrate. And as a reminder, please take your copy of In Focus and take the envelope as well. And again, never to miss an opportunity. Please consider making a tax-deductible contribution to the JPC. Now, this will not be a traditional policy forum that you might be familiar with, in which I'll have a rigorously structured program. Rather, it is intended to be a free-flowing forum. To accomplish this in any meaningful fashion, you need an extraordinary moderator, one who is quick on his feet and fully grounded on the issues. Now, you're all in luck because we actually have one of those tonight. Our moderator this evening is equal to the panelists in his scope of knowledge and the depth of his insights, and I am thrilled that Michael Medved is joining us. For those of you that don't know Michael, For those of you that don't know Michael, he is a scholar, an author, a fellow Philadelphian, a film critic, and a radio talk show host. And you can listen to him here in New York every day on AM 970, The Answer. He's on from 3 to 5. His many books are available for sale outside for purchase, including his new cookbook. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure. Please welcome Michael Medved.
I think restaurant reviewer is one of the very few careers I've never considered. Because outside of New York City, if you're eating kosher, it's a fairly limited array. But in any event, one correction, with all due respect for my good friend Matt Brooks, there is one aspect of the evening that will be very rigidly structured, and that is the time that we conclude. There's a reason for that. I mean, part of the reason is my heritage. I don't believe in Jewish Standard Time. I believe in German Jewish Standard Time. My late mother was born in Germany, and my grandfather, may he rest in peace, had the very good sense of moving to the United States in 1934. In any event, yeah, I would applaud for that, because I probably wouldn't be here. But in any event, we are all here tonight, and the other thing that will be very rigidly structured is the time that we conclude. We are going to be done at 8:30. And so we are going to proceed with all due haste. And okay, I'll tell you, the reason we're going to be done at 8:30 is because I have a very important dinner date with our Bechorah, with our oldest daughter, who lives here in New York City and is, though she would be embarrassed for me to tell you this, is an outstanding teacher at a school that many of you may know, which is SAR. You can't hear me? Can you hear me? You know what? No? Now you hear? Okay. Yes, the punchline was SAR. Okay. Thank you. Now, to proceed to introducing our very distinguished panel, we could use up a great deal of time giving all of their credentials, so I'm going to basically underpraise them, because these are truly three of the leading lights on American commentary and particularly on national security issues. John Podhoretz, who has become a very dear friend, is of course known as editor of Commentary magazine. He is also my fellow film critic, where he writes amazingly amusing and insightful reviews for the Weekly Standard. And he also writes a regular and indispensable column for the New York Post. And John also, many of you may not know, served as a speechwriter both to President Reagan and to President George Herbert Walker Bush. John Podhoretz. Jonathan Schanzer is most importantly a former director of this organization, the Jewish Policy Center. But perhaps even more importantly than that, he is now the Vice President for Research of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which has grown into a very, very important voice on issues of national security for the United States and really the survival of democracy in general. Before the FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, he worked as a terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, where, no, he did not work for Lois Lerner, where he played an integral role in the designation of numerous terrorist financiers. He's also a research fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and he was, as I mentioned, director of the Jewish Policy Center. Jonathan is the author of numerous works. One of the most intriguing is Palestinian Pulse, What Policymakers Can Learn from Palestinian Social Media. And we will ask him about that. Jonathan Schanzer. And the Honorable Douglas Feith is someone who I think of what a New Yorker named Grover Cleveland once had said about him, We love him for the enemies he has made. Doug Feith is one of those people who has been in the arena in national security issues, the arena of public service, particularly with the Defense Department. During the Reagan administration, he worked at the White House as a Middle East specialist for the National Security Council, during which period of time there was a considerably warmer relationship between the nation of Israel and the United States of America, and the White House in particular. He also served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Negotiations Policy. Most notably, Douglas Feith was in the Defense Department and helped to devise the response to the September 11th attacks. He served as the Undersecretary of Defense and was there in that capacity as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy from July 2001 until August of 2005. Fateful years indeed. Today, Doug is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, the Honorable Douglas Feith. All right, and we are going to make sure that there's a chance for people in this wonderful crowd to ask your own questions before we conclude promptly at 8:30 for the evening. Question first for each of you, and it's an unusual question, but one that I hope will be refreshing for a forum about the Middle East. Let's do something completely different, beginning with Douglas Feith. Can you give us one bit of good news recently to come out of the Middle East?
My nephew is having a baby.
Okay, you're
Lives in Jerusalem.
You're upstaging. You're
Okay.
upstaging.
I had one, so I just wanted to get it out before I forgot. That's
okay.
That is a challenging question. First of all, it's great that the Jewish Policy Center is hosting us here and put this forum together, and I appreciate that. I guess if one wants to look at some good news, a historical perspective is useful. And as bad as a lot of circumstances are in the Middle East right now, in many ways, Israel's position, and especially militarily, is basically good news. I mean, Israel is a strong country. It is strong economically. It is strong militarily. It faces very serious challenges, and the Iranian nuclear program is at the top of that list. And I don't mean in any way to belittle the importance of the challenges that it faces, but it is good news that Israel is creative, it is bold, it is militarily capable. The military is backed politically in the country and stands on a foundation of a very strong economy. And I think that as one evaluates Israel's problems, it's useful to evaluate it with some appreciation of the fact that it's not a complete oy vey situation.
Jonathan Schanzer.
Well, I would say that that the good news right now, at least from my perspective, is that Hamas is in a lot of trouble. I will elaborate.
And John, I think you have to literally swallow the microphone.
Okay. Better? All right. What I was saying is that Hamas is in a lot of trouble. The war that was fought this summer was actually an attempt by Hamas to break out of financial isolation. This isolation stemmed from the fact that there was about a year where things were going very well for Hamas. You had Mohamed Morsi in Egypt, and he was facilitating the transfer of cash and weapons and all sorts of goods in those tunnels that went beneath the Sinai Peninsula into the Gaza Strip. When that stopped, Hamas found itself in a very different situation. In other words, when Abdel Fattah al-Sisi came in, he's not terribly well loved here in the United States, or at least by our administration, but there's one thing that he has done, and that is that he has cracked down on Hamas, probably, and he's done more than the United States and Israel combined since Hamas was founded in 1987. Now, what he's done is he has destroyed no less than 1,800 smuggling tunnels. This is huge because for several reasons. One, the cash would come through. This is how Hamas would replenish its banks, because the banks are cut off from the formal financial sector. And so it used to be that we called it bulk cash smuggling at the Treasury Department, but basically people would be carrying suitcases and trash bags full of cash into the banks, and that was one thing that went through these tunnels. The other thing, of course, is the rockets. We all know about the thousands of rockets, of course, that Hamas had collected and fired at Israel. But then on top of that, there were the goods that came through. And this includes food, it includes clothing, it includes toys. I mean, you name it. We heard everything from golf clubs to Viagra that went through these tunnels. And what would happen is Hamas would take 10 or 20 or even 30% off the top. They would tax it. And this really enabled Hamas to swell its coffers. Hamas now, when you look at their budget, it's probably, and it's not like they go to Ernst & Young and settle up at the end of every year, but we think they were working on about $1 billion budget. I now believe it's down to about $300 million. That's good news.
John Podhoretz.
Well, I hate to be the guy who spits in the punch bowl, but I think the story, of course, is not the good news, or whatever good news one can come up with, is a part per million in a situation that is nearing catastrophe all around the Middle East. And maybe the only good news is that because much of this catastrophe is the result of bad American leadership, it can probably be reversed by better American leadership at some point in the near future. It's hard to imagine worse American leadership following what we have right now. You know, today, this afternoon on the website of The Atlantic magazine, Jeffrey Goldberg published an article in which he quoted two senior administration officials speaking about Bibi Netanyahu and the Israeli government in shockingly vulgar, dismissive, and foul terms. Deeply personal and very odd, too, because he was accused of being a chicken blank. The idea being that he does terrible things that make him impossible. He was called Aspergery, which is exactly the wrong word to describe Bibi, who is a very complicated person, but if anything, he's more like a tuning fork to the opinions of others rather than somebody who does not understand the emotions and feelings of others. And then an accusation that he basically is a coward because when he had the chance to hit Iran in 2010, he didn't do it. Why? Because the United States prevented him from doing it and he was too cautious, and now it's too late, and that, in the eyes of a senior Obama administration official, makes him a coward. A coward. Now, this is the view expressed. We understand that the Obama administration has a unique kind of hostility toward Israel, but pull back from Israel and look at what this means. This is an American ally. Right now, the United States is in the midst of very serious negotiations with an American enemy in Iran. There is no way on earth that in the course of a discussion with a reporter, any administration official would speak of this enemy, which just put a woman, to death yesterday for the crime of speaking out openly, that they would speak as dismissively and hostilely about one of the worst countries in the world as they speak about Israel. And if you look at the meta meaning of that, from Iran to Syria, to ISIS, to bizarrely friendly relations with Turkey. What you see is a portrait of a uniquely American crisis, a crisis that we created. Much of this crisis totally unnecessary, the result of a misguided ideological framing. And so, while I would like to say that the oil fields in the Mediterranean and the possibility of shale oil under Ashkelon and all of that are transformative, I still think that we are years away from anything getting resolved in a way that benefits American interests, benefits American allies, and benefits the world. I wish it were otherwise, but I just can't think happily right now.
Just to make my own contribution very briefly about one item of good news, and I don't think this is working at all. Is it? Okay. Yes, that's what I said. One item of good news: the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, released a table a couple of weeks ago, and it was a table of the 40 countries that they cover from the OECD, and they asked about the birth rate, the fertility rate. And of all of the countries in the OECD, they were all below 2.7, except for Israel, which was over 3. Now this, two generations after the Holocaust, is manifestly good news. Actually, it includes all of the nation of Israel. But there's reason to believe that the Jewish sector is at least equal to the, quote, Arab sector of the population when it's broken down. And partially because the birth rate has been increasing in Israel together with prosperity. It's also the only country where generally when countries become more prosperous, the birth rate goes down. That's happened in Mexico, it's happened in Brazil, it's happened all over the world. Apparently, thank God, that is not happening in Israel. So John Podhoretz was right the first time to talk about his nephew. All right. Since John has raised very forcefully the obvious problems right now between the leadership in Jerusalem, and yes, it is in Jerusalem, not Tel Aviv, the leadership in Jerusalem and the leadership in Washington, D.C. with this administration. John, you made the comment, and maybe Douglas, you can follow up on it, that there seems to be a unique hostility, a unique annoyance factor that this administration has with Israel. There's a screenwriter I know named Bert Perlutsky who actually framed it very well. He said that the Obama administration seems to be more worried about someone in Jerusalem building an apartment than he is worried about someone in Tehran building a nuclear weapon. How would you explain what appears to many people to be a hostile reaction to our strongest ally in the Middle East on the part of this administration?
Well, I think there's Doug actually published an article in Commentary in 2010 in which he proposed a theory that I believe we called restrainment. That was that the Obama doctrine was a doctrine of American self-restraint, the idea that the United States was a bad actor rather than a good actor on the international stage, and that it needed to be wrapped in a multilateral embrace that would restrain American ambitions. This is an odd thing, you would think, for a president who otherwise seems to love the exercise of centralized power to believe, but nonetheless, there it is, and he does believe this. And I think that Israel stands, as it often has for American liberals and leftists, as a rebuke to the notion that the use of force is now an anachronism that needs to be betrayed, that the defense of a stout nationalism and national interest is an atavism that needs to be fought, that national pride as opposed to sort of international modesty, is a condition that needs to be quashed. And Israel stands as a rebuke to many of the most beloved ideas of post-Vietnam American liberalism, and it is a burr under the fingernail of people who believe this, and they cannot get rid of it, because despite this opinion being almost universal in certain quarters, it is not an opinion that is shared by the vast majority of the American people, who see in Israel a commonality, not a distinction, who believe in American nationalism. They are not enemies of it, who believe in the forthright notion that their nation is good, not bad, which is the same conviction that animates the Zionist project. And so I think that there is a deep fissure that is ideological in form that makes this a different kind of hostility from the hostility that, say, you might have toward a trading partner who does you wrong, or an ally who, like Jacques Chirac with George W. Bush, does bad things to you when you're trying to get something done. This is a different feeling, and it's a feeling of this kind of deep ideological divide that they cannot get over to the American people.
Doug?
To maybe to make it somewhat easier to understand this phenomenon that John Podhart's just outlined, I think it's useful to recognize that the view that President Obama brought to the White House is not idiosyncratic. I mean, he's not the one guy in America who has this view. It's a view that predominates in a sector of our country. Basically, if you think about the faculties of leading universities in America, the view that America is what's wrong with the world, and that American history is a history of selfishness, aggression, denying other people rights. I mean, that's a very common view among people who teach history, political science, international affairs at American universities, at the leading American universities. And so anybody who actually is familiar with intellectuals in the United States in general would not find any of those views shocking, although I think the American public in general would find them shocking. And President Obama is interesting because I think he brought very standard ideas along those lines with him to the White House. And in that sense, I think he's very ideological. He looks at the world through a certain set of premises, and it's quite clear that it's very hard for him to absorb information that is not in line with his premises, which is, I would say, the definition of ideological. He's very ideological, but there's a common misconception that people who are people who are ideological are not pragmatic, and people who are pragmatic are not ideological. And that's not true. I mean, people who are ideological and not at all pragmatic don't have successful careers in politics. But many people who have successful careers in politics are both ideological and pragmatic. And Obama is. And he's pragmatic enough to want political success. And he has understood that if he is forthright in laying out his views, which are really quite radical and at odds with those of the American people in general, he will not be a political success. And so he's found ways to talk about international affairs that involves a certain amount of wordplay. I mean, like the word leadership. So, for example, most Americans think that what leadership means is the United States stakes out a position that is important for the United States, and we hope to recruit other people to follow us. kind of a standard view of leadership. What President Obama has said is leadership means that when America acts, we don't act by ourselves. That when we act with many other countries. In a certain sense, that's the opposite of leadership. That says you make sure that you're always in the middle of the pack. So who's leading the pack? Well, that's not the important thing. The important thing is to be in the pack. Now, it's a very odd way to deal with the word leadership, but he knows that leadership is a political necessity. So he says he's in favor of leadership, but then he redefines the term. You've seen similar things in his relationship with Israel, but fundamentally, the university professoriate is basically very unsympathetic to Israel. President Obama reflects that lack of sympathy. He was political and maneuvering for many years. Now, at the tail end of his second term in office, I think the kinds of things that you cited that administration officials said in this Jeffrey Goldberg article are probably going to become more common. And I think you're going to see more of the ideology and less of the political maneuvering in some of the rhetoric about Israel. But I think fundamentally, in the same way that this group, of which Obama is a leading example, thinks that America is what's wrong with the world, I think President Obama thinks that Israel is what's wrong with the Middle East. And the lack of sympathy reflects that view.
If let me just go to Jonathan Schanzer. And this is, in a sense, this is the opposite of the first question with which I began. We have 2 more years, a little bit more than 2 more years, of the Obama presidency. And it is 2 years that can be fraught with all kinds of dangers for Israel and for the United States. If you were to focus on the prime threat to American security and to American interests that this administration will need to confront, not waiting for the next administration, that this administration must confront at some point in the next 2 years, what would that threat be?
Look, there's an easy answer to that question, and I think it's actually at the core of what both John and Doug were talking about, and that is, of course, the Iranian nuclear threat. It is far and away the only true existential threat that Israel is dealing with right now, and by the way, that the United States is dealing with, whether we know it or not, in the White House. Now, I would actually argue that some of the dissonance that we're seeing right now in Washington stems from the fact that the Israelis are simply not allowing the United States to lay up in these joint plan of action, JPOA negotiations, which are set to expire on November 24th and will likely produce yet another interim agreement. And the Israelis are extremely nervous that Iran is going to maintain certain capabilities, that we are now giving up on centrifuges. We're giving up on what we would call the sunset provision, which would allow Iran to resume its nuclear program, let's say 5 or 7 or 10 years down the line. There are all these different aspects, these technical aspects of the negotiations that the Israelis are extremely concerned about. They do not want the United States to walk away without having solved this entirely. And that is at the in my opinion, that's at the core of what is going on here. Bibi wants more out of Obama. Obama wants to pivot, okay? They will not be on the same page in this regard. Obama wants to get the deal done and walk away, make it someone else's problem. But this gets to your point, Michael, and that is that there is no way to just have another interim deal or one that only lasts for 5 or let's say 10 years, and then the Iranians get another opportunity to put that nuclear program back online. And that's what they're thinking about right now, is they'll make a deal with the Obama administration. Obama will walk away, give everybody a high five, and say, look, we postponed this for 10 years. But the issue is that at the end of someone else's administration, they're going to have to tackle this issue yet again. And look, when we talk about Iran, we're talking about the most dangerous regime on the planet, getting the most dangerous weapon on the planet. If it was the Shah, I don't think we would care. It's this regime that we're the most troubled by, and we're going to have to tackle this. The problem is that we just don't seem to have the will to get the right deal done, and the Israelis know it.
John, let me ask you, you review movies, as I do, and write a movie. And the movie is looking back from 2019. We're in the very end of October 2019. What do you think has happened regarding the Iranian nuclear threat 5 years from now? Is it a bittersweet romance? Is it a comedy? Is it a thriller? Or is it a post-apocalyptic horror story?
Well, I'd probably go in that scenario with thriller, but I would say that if you're really thinking about this, and this is, I think you thought about this because this is precisely the scenario that Bret Stephens deals with in his new book, America in Retreat, which arose from an article he wrote in Commentary called The Coming Global Disorder. And I bring that up because I think it is very hard to game out the next 2.5 years. A lot of things have happened just in the last year that nobody would have thought conceivable in October of 2013. ISIS taking an area the size of New England, a chunk out of Iraq. We have the possibility of ISIS taking Baghdad or the Baghdad airport. We have decided that we are going to try to retard their advance. The president said he would downgrade and destroy ISIS, but he didn't mean it, obviously, because we are not using sufficient force to do that. He is so desperately committed not to having boots on the ground that he doesn't even want to use sufficient air power that would then possibly require the boots on the ground to secure the territory that ISIS would have lost if we really pushed hard. So that was unanticipatable somehow, except for the sense that things were going south, that disorder was increasing, that because would we have thought that the refusal to strike Syria after the president said that the red line was crossed would lead to an anti-Syrian regime, irredentist, jihadist movement made up of former Iraqi military leaders moving into Iraq? No, but that is one of the conditions that is created by this vacuum. I mean, last week we learned that the regime in North Korea, we've all joked, oh, it's hilarious, and Kim Jong, he's missing, he's fat, he's silly, he watches movies, and he's so fat that they managed to get a ballistic missile onto a warhead, onto a ballistic missile. And the range of missile that they are testing, not that I think that they will fire off a missile at the United States necessarily, but the range of the North Korean missile is designed to reach San Francisco. Now, again, I don't think you should look back from 2019 and say San Francisco was destroyed by a North Korean missile, but who knows what's going to happen? The Chinese are testing us in the South China Sea. Obviously, there is going to be some massive political instability generated by the Ebola crisis in Africa. There are weird things going on in South America. I mean, that is what happens when the world's only superpower decides to walk off the stage. And how you game it out is almost impossible, except to say, it doesn't look like anything good is going to happen. Would we have expected Russia to take a bite out of Ukraine? To literally, that Russia would annex a section of a country that is part of Europe. Europe. We're not talking about Tajikistan. We're not talking about Afghanistan. We're talking about a country in Europe. It has taken a bite out of this country. We have acceded to its annexation. It may now annex eastern Ukraine without the world doing anything but whining a little bit. That is not a powerful country anymore, Russia. That is a third-rate, tin pot dictatorship that does not threaten us in any way. We are doing nothing except trying to bankrupt a couple of Putin's friends. This is bizarre. And so I don't know how to write the script The most interesting thing would be to come up with, some country you never heard of, suddenly, Burma suddenly gets a nuclear weapon. I don't know.
Independent Catalonia. Douglas Feith, you have served in the Defense Department under two presidents, and how, with the threats that we're facing, and we're going a little bit afield from the Middle East to talk about North Korea, but we can also talk about the very alarming piece in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend about the development of Chinese nuclear submarines, and a huge commitment to that. In that context, how important is it for the United States to maintain or to increase our defense budget?
We have cut our defense budget and to the point where we're severely limiting our ability to project power. The Navy is heading toward a smaller number of ships than we've had for 100 years, and we're not investing in long-range strike capabilities. And we're not in a position to do what President Obama himself has said he wants to do. John referred to the term pivot. A few years ago, the Obama administration said it wanted to essentially turn its attention away from the Middle East toward the strategically important East Asian region. And this was known as the pivot. The administration then got embarrassed because people said, you're turning your back on the Middle East. So they said, no, all we want to do is we want to rebalance our forces. So they say they prefer the term rebalance rather than pivot. But basically, they're talking about a recognition of the enormous strategic significance and economic importance of East Asia. And they said, we want to shift our strategic focus. One of the things that's happened with the Middle East is the Middle East pulled the attention of the administration back, and we're now militarily engaged in the Middle East again in a rather feckless fashion, as John rightly pointed out, but nevertheless, there we are, and we're engaged. And we are not paying attention, and we are not devoting the resources to develop the capabilities that will actually allow us to reassure our allies in Asia in light of very aggressive Chinese policies, an aspect of which was highlighted, as you said, with their deployment of nuclear-capable submarines. They have an aircraft carrier. They're making territorial claims on waters throughout Asia. And if one talks to South Koreans, Japanese, Taiwanese, Singaporeans, Australians, they all say the same thing, which is that there's high anxiety that the American protective umbrella, the American nuclear umbrella and the American conventional defense umbrella, does not provide the comfort now, and it's going to be even worse in the future as these defense cuts make their way, over the years, does not provide the comfort that we've traditionally provided. I'd like to say one other thing which ties a number of threads together from Jonathan's remarks and your remarks about how Iran, for example, connects to North Korea. And it's an interesting thing. I mean, I've thought about the looking back exercise that you posed to John, but not from the point of view of looking back after 3 or 4 or 5 years. When history, when historians look back perhaps 30 or 40 or 50 years from now to what's happening in the world right now, it's possible that the thing of greatest significance, looking back, is going to be the Iranians, in defiance of the world, in defiance of the International Atomic Energy Agency and the UN Security Council and the United States and the European Union negotiators that worked on the subject, in defiance of everybody, the Iranians got a nuclear weapon. And what I would suggest that people think about, there's a lot to worry about in that regard, directly from the point of view of what the Iranian regime itself might do if it gets a nuclear weapon. But let's leave that aside. Let's take the rosiest possible thought that the Iranians are going to get the weapon and they're going to behave like Boy Scouts. So they're going to behave completely. So let's set that problem aside, which I don't think is realistic, but let's just set it aside. The effect of Iran getting a nuclear weapon in defiance of the entire architecture of non-proliferation policy in the world and all the institutions that were set up to prevent this, the effect would be possibly to send a message to every medium-sized country in the world that the era in which a handful of large powers controlled all the nuclear weapons in the world is over. And every self-respecting medium-sized country needs nuclear weapons. And if we find ourselves 30 or 40 or 50 years from now in a world that has 30 or 40 or 50 nuclear powers, as opposed to the current 8 or 9, that is a much more dangerous world. That is a world in which the danger of nuclear warfare is extremely high. And when people look back at what has happened in the world that makes the world extremely dangerous and could actually, depending on how things go, overwhelm all the concerns about climate change and everything else, because if you have major nuclear wars, the effect on the environment is so much greater than everything else that people are agitated about in this area. When they look back and say, what got us from the point where for about 50 years we only had 6 or 7 or 8 nuclear powers in the world and there were no nuclear wars, to the point where you have 20 or 30 or 40 nuclear powers in the world and nuclear war is a major danger, the tipping point could be the Iranians getting their weapon in defiance of everybody.
Right now,
that's what's at stake.
But by the way, this is where what's gone on over the last couple of years is so dumbfounding, and why there is a certain reason for optimism in 2017, which is to say that so much of this is the result literally of a kind of withdrawal of American affect, that if we were around as a conventional superpower walking around the world saying, wait a minute, don't do that, don't do this, we're sending an aircraft carrier over there, don't do that, hey Chinese, don't be threatening Japanese islands over there, what are you doing, why are you doing that? All we're doing is trying to maintain orderly shipping, trade routes, make it possible for things to happen. It's a kind of enforcement of order that simply comes from American military power and the willingness both to treat other countries like adults and to assume that there are conventional costs and benefits to a connection to the United States. And that can probably be reasserted with not all that much difficulty. It was the bizarre conclusion of the Obama administration that American power meant war, that all American power and a strong America meant was that we were inevitably going to put 150,000 people into a country where we shouldn't have men on the ground, and now we can't have anybody anywhere. We're going to be out of Afghanistan, we'll be out of Iraq, there can't be any American soldiers doing anything except walking point on an existing base in a country where there's no threat. That is not an understanding of that is not an adult understanding of American power. American power is largely benign. It's largely about, as I say, sort of enforcing international norms of the sort that Doug is talking about. There could be 8 nuclear countries because 6 or 7 of them were all in alliance with one another. It wasn't just that they functioned together as a unit, and that's also something else that the United States is degrading. NATO. I mean, the NATO umbrella, the
Let me-
American umbrella.
John, let me play devil's advocate for a while and then go to Jonathan Schanzer for a response. And this is something everyone in this audience tonight has heard the kind of lines that I'm going to feed up to Jonathan Schanzer to have him tee off on, because they're very common. And they are lines that are believed by people of all political parties. You hear this everywhere. This is a drumbeat of emails and phone calls we get on the radio show. People believe this. Okay, why should we exert power on other countries? If we minded our own business, we would be safer. We are expending billions of dollars. The United States military, it's true, has a larger budget than the top 20 other militaries in the world combined. Why do we need all that power? If we would leave the rest of the world alone, if we wouldn't involve ourselves in their business and their disputes and their affairs, we would be so much safer. They would leave us alone, particularly in regard to the burgeoning fight in the Middle East between crazy Shiites and crazy Sunnis. Why should we get in between these two forces? Wouldn't it be better if we followed the prescription that Senator McGovern put to the American people in 1972 and triumphantly carried Massachusetts, no other states, but Massachusetts? Come home, America. Let's do nation building at home. How about it, Jonathan Schanzer?
Wow, okay. Look, first of all, this idea that we should just allow the Shiites, Sunnis to kill themselves, look, to a certain extent that might be very appealing to all of us. You got the Saudi bloc against the Iranian bloc, and they're going to start beating each other up, and this is what Michael would call the alien versus predator scenario, where you sit back and open up a bag of popcorn and enjoy the show. Look, first of all, there's a problem with that in that someone is going to have to win, and then you're going to have to deal with them. And that's exactly what we're dealing with in Syria right now. That eventually, I mean, this is sort of a dream scenario, that you got the Nusra Front and ISIS and Al-Qaeda fighting against the IRGC, Hezbollah, and the Assad regime. I mean, may they continue to fight for another 30 years. At least that's the way some people would put it. But look, to the specific question that you ask about why we need to be involved. Look, there was a debate, not even really a debate that took place. By the end of the Bush administration, we heard that Americans were war-weary. We heard that the United States, the Bush doctrine was too aggressive, that we treated every problem with military might, we were trying to transform the region, that we had overextended ourselves. And as a result, there were hundreds of thousands of people that were killed, and the Middle East was a mess. And so then what we had was President Obama come in, and of course, he was promising hope, he was promising change, but more importantly, he believed that his mandate was to get us out of old wars and not allow us to get into new ones. And he said this on multiple occasions. But let me just explain what's happened when you get us out of wars before their time and stay out of wars when you actually need to get into them. You have the rise of ISIS. You have the mess that you're seeing right now in Syria and Iraq. And if you look closely at the casualty figures, staying out of these wars or getting out of them before we were ready has led to as many casualties, if not more. I mean, the number of casualties we're hearing right now in Syria is 200,000, but the unofficial is probably closer to 400,000, and that's just because we can't account for the number of people that have gone missing through the chlorine bombs and the barrel bombs that have been dropped on civilian positions. And so this is what happens when we walk away from the region. It descends into chaos. Someone needs to help maintain order. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to get involved in every conflict every time a new flashpoint emerges. But I do think that America has always been governed well from the center when it comes to foreign policy. That we've had this kind of maybe a bit of a pendulum swing. But we need to find some middle ground, and I think Americans will respond well to it.
But, you know, I just want to say, the United States, there are plenty of places in the world the United States does not involve itself. 750,000 people were slaughtered in Rwanda in the 1990s, and we sat by and let it happen. Why? There's no oil there. There are no important natural resources there. We had no national interest in Rwanda. Now let me tell you about a shul near me. Some of you may know it. So this is a shul that's quite post-Zionist, so they don't have a lot of pro-Israel stuff over the bima. But they did for 10 years have a Save Darfur banner that covered the cross that was there when it was church on Sunday and not on Saturday. Why? Why did they say Save Darfur? Because there is a certain understanding of the world in which the only moral intervention is an intervention that does not involve the national interest, because it's self-sacrificing, it's charitable. It's the nature of charity that you don't give to your own children, you give to a stranger, right? So that is the nature of charity, and there are other sorts of things. But in fact, everybody understands rationally that we have a deep national interest in the Middle East and some semblance of stability in the Middle East, because the lifeblood of the world economy is pumped out of the ground there. And if you really wanted to make sure that the Middle East was not important, you would open the Keystone Pipeline. You would have fracking everywhere on earth you could have it. You would do everything you could to weaken the importance of the oil that sits in the lakes under Saudi Arabia and under Iran. But in fact, that is not the animating policy of this administration, as it happens, or indeed of the liberal agenda, because they don't really mean it when they say, "Come home, America." What they mean is, do it the way I want to do it. Intervene where I want you to intervene. Intervene in the way I want you to intervene.
Well, John, the Secretary of State has said that the gravest national security threat to the United States is climate change. So we don't have to address that here. We don't have to address that here. Douglas Feith, and then...
By the way, maybe it is. Maybe it is. The last thing you can do, if you actually believe this to the depth of your being, is to withdraw from the world stage. If you believe that climate change is the world's natural threat, the United States is going to have to take the lead in figuring out how on earth to pull, to change the nature of the supposed, greenhouse gas warming. You can't stay home. You have to do the opposite of staying home.
Last question is for Douglas Feith. One of the very disturbing elements in the Jeffrey Goldberg article that he was citing, that was just posted on the Atlantic website, and it will ruin your evening if you actually go home and read it. So please don't. You're getting enough of a flavor here. But one of the things that Jeffrey Goldberg says, quoting high administration sources, is that the plan is, after the election, which by the way is 1 week from today, after the election, the Obama administration means to withdraw its diplomatic cover for Israel at the UN, which would mean the possibility of Abu Mazen, the Palestinian president, has said that he is going to be pushing to have a Security Council deadline to end the occupation, to have full UN recognition of an independent state of Palestine. This has been stopped at the Security Council only by the determination of the United States. Unfortunately, Canada does not have a veto in the United Nations. And long live and God bless Stephen Harper. Yeah, isn't it amazing? And by the way, he doesn't have Jewish voters. Really, he doesn't. There are in Canada, there are about 4 times as many Muslim voters as there are Jewish voters. This is pure
Say,
leadership.
Michael, where do you write about that?
Well, this is in Commentary Magazine.
Commentary Magazine, Michael Medved.
Which conservatives
everyone, in Canada.
You understand, it's
Google
very important you read and study and learn Torah and commentary. Very important. Okay, Douglas Feith, what would be Israel's response? What would be the recourse for Israel or friends of Israel? Because this is not something that requires Senate approval. It's not something that involves the House of Representatives. It is something the administration could do. If something like that occurred, what is the proper response for our friends and brothers in Israel?
Well, the first thing is to recognize that it really is a serious problem. I mean, I think there are many people who look at the UN and think nothing that happens at the UN is all that serious. There's a lot of talk. It doesn't result in very much. I think if you look sweep of Israeli history, one of the things you see is Israel's enemies have tried various approaches to damaging Israel, and for that matter, the Zionist enterprise even before Israel came into being. And there were conventional attacks, and there were diplomatic attacks, and there was the use of terrorism, there was the use of this kind of inventive, low-intensity conflict called the Intifada. And basically Israel, and the use of rockets, Israel checked all of those kinds of attacks systematically, one after another, to the point where, as I said in my opening comments, it's actually impressive how strong Israel is against all these various kinds of threats. But Israel's enemies are always adapting. And what is known as asymmetric warfare is the way relatively weak parties launch wars against relatively strong parties. What they do is they look for areas of vulnerability. They don't attack the strong party where the party is strong. You attack in an opening. And Israel's enemies have found two major vulnerabilities. One, which we've talked about, the Iranian nuclear program and the possibility of Israel being vulnerable to that capability. But the second major vulnerability that Israel has, and I think it is a strategic vulnerability, is in what might be called the battlefield of ideas or ideological warfare. And Israel's enemies are focused on that. And it's a very interesting question historically why the Israelis are as vulnerable as they are. It's partly because the Israelis, in some ways, almost arrogantly refuse to condescend to engage in defending their own legitimacy. It's an interesting attitude, but the fact is it's created a major vulnerability. And Israel's enemies are engaged in a campaign, the purpose of which is to delegitimate Israel, to make it look like South Africa, to denounce Israel as an apartheid state. And if you go back and you look at the speeches that Abbas gives every year at the UN, one of the key themes of those speeches year after year is the invocation of South Africa and apartheid, and the argument that Israel is an apartheid state and should be treated by countries around the world the way apartheid South Africa was treated. And the goal is to damage, to squeeze, to isolate, to hurt economically and hurt ideologically Israel. And it represents an extremely serious threat. And this is something that people who know that they want to hurt Israel and know that they don't have the ability to hurt Israel through conventional military means or even unconventional military means have found a non-military means that they can use to do damage. And I think the idea that people in the Obama administration would suggest that they would facilitate or at least stand aside while Palestinian Authority officials would use the UN in this fashion to get a major ideological campaign rolling against the Israelis is something that should be taken very seriously because the potential for harm is great. And it should be fought by all the means that people who care about American national security policy and disagree with the administration would fight with, speaking out and making arguments and demonstrating and using getting the ear of members of Congress and doing all the things that people do when in a democracy, when they oppose a policy of the administration.
All right, let us go, and Jonathan, the first question will go directly to Jonathan Schanzer, who's eager to say something on that. We have a microphone in the back. If people want to line up at the microphone in the back, that might be a good way to begin. And please, questions, please, and short answers, please, and questions, not filibusters. Yes, sir, first question.
Douglas, John, Jonathan, let's say President Obama goes to sleep tonight. He has a good night's sleep, and he has a dream. And the dream tells him that he must destroy and take out the military-industrial complex of Iran. Would that be a good idea?
Jonathan
Yes.
Panzer.
Yes.
Well, let's put it this way. President Obama has said that an Iranian nuclear weapon is unacceptable to the United States.
He drew a red line.
And no, but I mean, I think he did say that. I think he was right when he said it. He needs to take whatever action is required to give meaning to that, I think, correct statement.
Yeah, look, I would just add this, that I think it would do a number of things all at once. Number one, it would take care of a major threat. Number two, I think it would actually begin to reassert American power. You don't actually need to bomb Iran to reassert American power, but certainly this would go a long way in putting us back on the map, letting our enemies know that we are serious when we tell them that they are not to do something, that this would be a lesson learned. I think it would be incredibly important.
Next question.
You've described, this sense of disengagement by the administration and basically by the left as
I'll repeat the question when you speak in.
Okay. You have described basically this sense of disengagement or isolationism as being really more limited in terms of really the administration and the left itself. What I'm wondering and what I'm fearful for is that perhaps this is also something more of a global phenomenon with antecedents on the right. You saw this actually with the America First movement prior to World War II, that had elements of support from both left and right until eventually the Soviet Union was invaded by
let me
Nazi
take that on, because I think a lot of us were worried about this. A lot of us who believe in interventionist foreign policy and an America fully involved in the world were worried about this, and the political positions of Rand Paul and how strong they were going to be in the Republican race in 2016 and all of that. And the last 4 months have done a great deal to revise the sense that isolationism is on the march on the right. The polling data are inescapable that people on the right are American nationalists. They do not believe that American power projected is a wrong or an evil. Sometimes they think that it's unnecessary because we're too good, in this George Washington sense. But all the poll numbers that suggest support for the president when he said that he wanted ISIS, he wanted to downgrade and destroy ISIS, support for more serious action against ISIS, all of that was ballasted by enormous majorities on the right. And it remains the case that the left is much less comfortable with it. That indicates to me that the minute that people on the right saw a threat, and they took the threat seriously, and the threat was jihadist, terrorist irredentism, they clicked back to where they were, where they naturally are, where they stand on the political spectrum.
Next question.
Can you comment on Turkey and NATO and just its general role in the Middle East?
Comment on Turkey and NATO, and try to use polite language. Jonathan.
It's funny you should ask. This is actually a project that we've been working on at FDD for quite some time, and it's been a focus of mine for the last year in particular. I would say that, first of all, I never cared much about Turkey until, oh, sorry, I'll swallow the mic. I never cared much about Turkey up until actually the flotilla was about the first time that Turkey really came onto my radar. We'd always heard about the AKP, the Justice and Development Party, not exactly being lovely people wanting to celebrate Hanukkah with the Israelis or what have you. But it was that flotilla that first alerted me to the fact that there is a serious problem. When I look at Turkey today, I can point to several things that to me would necessitate an immediate removal from NATO. And I wrote about this a couple of weeks ago for Politico magazine, and the Turks are furious about this, but they cannot deny certain things. First of all, there is a significant Hamas presence right now in Turkey. That the man who planned and financed the attack on those 3 teens this summer in June, the kidnap and murder of those 3 teens in the West Bank. His name is Salah Arori. He is the head of the Qassam brigades for the West Bank, and he is based in Ankara today. On top of that, there are another 12 Hamas figures who were released by the Israelis during the Shalit deal, and they found their way to Turkey, and they have rock star status in Istanbul and Ankara today. Now, on top of that, we had a problem that many people didn't realize, because I think people are still wedded to this idea of Sunnis and Shiites not getting along. It turns out that the Turks were helping Iran evade sanctions for 2 years, and that amounted to more than $100 billion in sanctions busting on behalf of the Iranians. And the amazing thing is, of course, the Turks have been furious about Iran's support for Assad. Of course, I mean, they're allowing this money to go back into Iran, and of course it's making a U-turn right back into Syria. And so Turks were fighting both sides of this conflict. Now, one other thing that I think is incredibly important to note, that this ISIS phenomenon that we're dealing with right now would not be around today were it not for this barn door policy that the Turks have on their eastern border. Turkey today is what Pakistan has been to Afghanistan. It is an enabler. It is allowing the jihadists to come in and day out. Fighters are coming back into Turkey. They're getting hospitalized. They're getting more weapons. They're getting more money, and they're going back into the fight. This is not what a NATO ally does. And of course, we know right now that the Turks are standing by, watching and waiting for a massacre in Kobani, because they just simply don't care about the Kurds and will not come to their rescue. The Turks are in deep, deep trouble. We need to isolate them. We need to get them out of NATO, and we need to stop pretending that they're allies of the United States.
Next question, please.
I was very concerned about what you said, Jonathan, about the article that the Obama administration is starting now to betray Netanyahu the way you said. And I think that it's more than just the beginning. I think it is an immediate plan shortly after the election to actually agree with Iran, settle with them, and they know that Netanyahu is the only obstacle there. And they are now trying to marginalize him when he's going to start to make the noise and the objection to that. So I think it's a clear effort that it's coming. So my question is, what we as Jews in the United States and around the world can do right now, what do you suggest, other than just writing letters, what else can be done to really stop that effort to neutralize Israel in the world opinion?
Well, if I can just say, the one blessing in the United States is that there is an election every 2 years. And in this case, it is very important to note that when we talk about American support for Israel, we are no longer talking about 4 states in which Jews have majorities. The Jewish community is now divided, and half of Jews no longer really associate with Judaism, and blah, 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 blah. That is not what American support for Israel means now. American support for Israel is deep, it is broad, it goes far beyond, and indeed is potentially stronger than Jewish support for Israel. Numbers are somewhere between 55% and 70% support for Israel. Numbers for the Palestinians are incredibly low. The United States hates Iran. The people of the United States remember, the ones who were around old enough to remember 1979 and 1980. Iran is a despised and disliked country. It will not serve the party of the president well if he becomes an apologist for and an academite for Iran.
All right.
I hate to use that term, but it's true, and therefore one can presume, under those circumstances, that his party will do something to stop him before he makes it impossible for them to win in 2016.
Next question, please.
Yeah. The last time I saw treatment of Israeli leaders by the White House that we see today was under, I guess, your former boss, George H.W. Bush, the way he treated Prime Minister Shamir.
I have to dissociate myself. I was actually not a George H.W. Bush speechwriter, so I take no responsibility whatsoever for him.
I was talking to Mr. Fife. I think that
I wasn't in that administration.
Okay, I take it all back. So I'll throw it out to all of you. How do you contrast, or do you find similarities in motivations between the two?
I think that it's always useful to look at history to put things in perspective. And I think that if you go back and look at how unsympathetic Eisenhower was to Israel, that was remarkable. One of the major events in the history of the Eisenhower administration was Eisenhower's slapping of Israel, France, and Britain in 1956 over the Suez War. And it was really hostile. Jimmy Carter was extraordinarily hostile. Even as president, it's become a
Pathological?
Pathological since, but the roots of the pathology were in his presidency, and he was extremely hostile to Israel. And Zbigniew Brzezinski was an outspoken critic and opponent of Israel when he was serving as Jimmy Carter's national security advisor. President George H.W. Bush did have famous dislike for Shamir, and Secretary of State James Baker famously, notoriously made that really insulting, dismissive remark about if Israel wants peace, and he announced the phone number of the White House switchboard. He said they can call. So if one looks at the history of U.S.-Israeli relations, it's important to have perspective that administrations that are hostile and that fight and that slap and that insult the Israelis are that's part of a relationship that also has many positive aspects. So it's a mixed picture looking back over the years. The Obama administration, though, even with this historical perspective, I think is extraordinary.
By the way, important to note, the H.W. Bush administration featured the last gasp of what used to be known as the old right. That was a certain type of realpolitik foreign policy that said, why are we supporting this little country when there are 22 more important countries around it, and it's a socialist country, we don't like it, they're socialists, and these countries, you can deal with them, we know them, their Bechtel deals with them, we know them, it's fine. And the Obama administration comes at this from a much more ideological frame. The H.W. Bush administration's perspective is gone. It's now lost in the midst of history, thank God. And now we have a much different and sharper, I think, assault, because it's much more based on the essence of Israel rather than simply its strategic position in the Middle East.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we have to wrap this up in just a few minutes. So if you can state a question briefly, I will jot it down. Then we will do a lightning round with the panel and try to get in all the questions that people have been waiting patiently. Go ahead.
Okay, this is mostly directed to the Honorable Douglas Feith. After the September 11th attacks, one wonders whether or not we could have responded in a more overwhelming and perhaps less sensitive manner to the civilians, and whether we might not be in a better posture now.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question.
If the Republicans win the Senate, how do you see that acting as a check on Obama's foreign policy?
Okay, great. Next question.
My question is directed to about Hamas, where I have been reading about the intifada that is now started in Israel, that Hamas is leading the Palestinians to perform a jihad right there. And if there were an election in Israel, who would win that election for the Palestinians? Would it be Hamas, or would it be the Palestinian Authority again?
Okay, next question.
We've spent a lot of time talking about one donkey. I want you to talk about another. who a lot of Jews support, Hillary Clinton. Will she be a friend of Israel more so?
Okay, I'm sorry, we're going to have to limit it to 3 more questions very quickly.
Your statements and opinions this evening have been very obvious to us. Why are they not obvious to John Kerry, to President Obama, and the rest of the mainstream media?
Okay, and 2 more.
In the event of Iran getting a nuclear weapon, do you see that Israel and the Gulf states working together, sort of under the table, that sort of thing, to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon? In other words, Israel making a deal or dealing with the Arab states.
Okay,
right next
great. Last question, lady, with the final question.
We've done a lot of Obama bashing tonight. So my question is, given the panel has a look-back perspective, which I agree with, what has the false Iraqi war done to build better relationships between the U.S. and the Middle East, or between the Middle East countries? And additionally, W. Bush did nothing when he learned over 10 years ago about the Iran's nuclear warfare. They did nothing. So please give that perspective. And would we be in a different place? And as Jews, would we be in a different place?
Great, thank you very much. If everyone can sit down, we will cover these questions very quickly. First of all, to Douglas Feith, should there have been a more robust, aggressive, proactive response toward the dangers of civilian support for terrorism after September 11th?
I think that the general response after September 11th was very energetic and accomplished something that almost nobody would have predicted, which is that we would go for 10, 12, 13 years after 9/11 and not have the follow-on attack that pretty much everybody believed was coming after 9/11. So I think that in general the administration did a good job. Were there flaws? Were there things we did wrong? Yes. If I had to name the number one, it would not be the one that the questioner highlighted about, attacking more boldly militarily. I would say the biggest gap in the war on terrorism strategy of the Bush administration and even and also of the Obama administration is the failure to have a serious effort to counter ideological support for terrorism. We just have fallen down on that as a country.
Let me quickly respond to what happens if the GOP wins the Senate. A week from tonight, we will probably know, pending late-breaking returns, because both Georgia and Louisiana have potential runoff elections after November, so this could be a marathon. In any event, what happens is the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate changes, and the agenda of the Senate changes. And when it comes to bringing up people to talk about in hearings, it's very different. And one thing that I think is very clear, if there actually had been Republican control of the Senate, Chuck Hagel would not have been confirmed as Secretary of Defense. And I think a world of hurt to American national security would have been avoided by that appalling appointment. Next question, the likelihood of a new intifada coordinated by Hamas, and also with that same question, if an election were held in, they said in Israel, but I suspect you mean the Palestinian territories, if an election were held in the West Bank, would Hamas win, or would the peace-loving and Jeffersonian Democrats of Fatah win?
With regard to the with regard to the Intifada, we've been hearing for years that the Palestinians are exhausted, that the second Intifada of 2000 to 2005 took a lot out of them, and that they remember how painful it was, not just in terms of the military response from the Israelis, but also economically, politically. It was devastating for both sides. And so the line that we continue to hear from the Israelis is that the Palestinians are not going to go back to that. But I would just note that what we're seeing in Jerusalem right now is something that is very new, that these Jerusalem Arab neighborhoods, them rising up, That is something of major concern because this is outside of the normal Palestinian political spectrum. It's an X factor. And so we're watching this very carefully. There is real cause for concern. As for just the political question very quickly, this is actually the subject of a book that's for sale after this, just by the way. And I would just say this, that there is no political culture in the Palestinian arena right now. That Mahmoud Abbas, as you all know, is now 9 years into a 4-year term. There is no room for new parties to come out. People will get arrested for criticizing Abbas on Facebook. So there is a reason why Hamas is popular. It's because Abbas is such a thug. We have to fix this if there is ever going to be change in the Palestinian political arena.
Next question, and this is for John Podhoretz. John wrote a book some years ago, I've never let him forget it, called Hillary, Can She Be Stopped? So John, Hillary, can she be stopped? Should she be stopped?
Well, I'm not going to answer about whether she could be stopped because the Jewish Policy Center is a 501c3 organization, as is commentary, and it can neither endorse nor can endorse candidates, nor can it speak in partisan terms. So I will not do that. What I will say is that one of the things that we learned about Hillary Clinton in 2008 is that, as Matt Brooks said at dinner tonight, she has a glass jaw. She's not a very good politician.
You're not talking about domestic violence against Hillary, are you? When you say she has a glass jaw, this could get you in trouble.
Okay.
Media matters.
She has a propensity for saying things that give her trouble that she need not say, like she was dead broke with an $8 million book contract. Or that businesses don't create jobs because apparently they're created by the jobs fairy. And she does this all the time, and she's done it her entire political career, and there's no reason to think that she is not vulnerable. Someone will have to make her vulnerable in the Democratic Party for her not to be the nominee. And I think that 2016, all the happy talk that you hear from liberals about the demographic changes in the United States that make a Democratic victory almost insuperable in 2016 failed to take account of the very particular qualities that Barack Obama brought to the elections in 2008, 2012. Enormous appeal to youth, 97% turnout among 97% support among African Americans who turned out at higher numbers than whites. There is no reason to believe that those numbers are duplicable by another candidate, and I think it's will be a much harder and closer fought and closer run election as a result.
Okay, Douglas Feith, and we're in the home stretch now. There's been a lot of Obama bashing tonight, and that's perhaps true. And the question is about the Iraq War. Did the Iraq War end up benefiting America's position in the Middle East? And what did President Bush do during his years as president that you did serve, President George W. Bush, about the Iranian nuclear threat?
The main aim of the Iraq War was to remove the regime of Saddam Hussein and his sons, who would have taken over after him, and that was accomplished. And I think there was value in removing that regime. And I think that that one of the things that lots of people would be talking about as a dreadful element of the Middle East, had we not removed Saddam Hussein, would have been all the continuation and aggravation of the threats that he posed when he was in power. So I think it was a good thing to remove Saddam. The war didn't go well, and when wars don't go well, and they are longer, and they are bloodier, and they are costlier than anybody anticipated, there are consequences of that. And one of the main consequences of that is we have Barack Obama as president, which is, I think, in part a reaction to the fact that the Iraq War didn't go well. And so that's a serious problem. It's not irremediable. I mean, as my colleagues have pointed out, there are elections. We do make changes, okay.
So what
I
about
think there's that. Now, on the question of what did George W. Bush do regarding Iran, there were diplomatic attempts to develop international pressure on Iran to test whether there were means short of war to stop the Iranians in their nuclear program. One cannot, I mean, I don't think any American president can contemplate using military power unless he comes to the conclusion that he has tried every reasonable means short of military action to solve the problem. And the Bush administration took a number of steps short of military action to address whether the problem can be solved. I think that in looking back, more could have been done.
Well, can I just say one important thing? There's a very bizarre thing about the end of the Bush administration. In the last year of the George W. Bush administration, this warmonger, this monster, this war lover who liked nothing more than bombs said on 3 or 4 occasions that if Iran got the bomb, everybody who acquiesced in it would be no better than Chamberlain and Munich. That is what he said. So it is an oddity if you think that somebody who believes that then did not take the action to remove the Iranian military threat, and he did not, and he has himself, I think, written a certain type of political and ideological epitaph should that happen.
All right. Jonathan Schanzer, Israel and the Gulf states, any cooperation going on under the table that we should find encouraging?
We know that there is a significant amount of cooperation right now between Israel and the Gulf states. And look, this is one of the very strange results of the foreign policy that we've seen embraced by the United States. This has produced a sort of a bizarro world, if you will, to cite a Seinfeldism, that you have the Saudis right now reaching out to the Israelis. I mean, these are the people who've been spreading Wahhabism around the world for several decades. They're now reaching out to the Israelis because they've given up on the idea that the United States is going to intervene and to neutralize that Iranian nuclear program. So they're reaching out to the next power in line that would be able to get the job done. They're reaching out to the Israelis. Now, one of the things we saw actually at the UN here just a couple of weeks ago was Bibi Netanyahu getting up on that stage, and it was a very strange moment where he was essentially asking the Gulf states to kind of come out of the closet, if you will, and to kind of own up to the relationship that they had with the Israelis. Bottom line is that will not happen, that there could be quiet cooperation, but these countries have been so force-fed with hate over the years, that the ideology will make it such that the population would reject true normalization. And we cannot forget that these might be partners against Iran, but they are not friends in the long term.
Okay, the last question I will take the opportunity of trying to answer, which is, when it is so obvious to so many of the people, probably most of the people who are here tonight, the truth of what this outstanding panel has been saying, John Podhoretz and Jonathan Schanzer and Douglas Feith, when our points of view seem so compelling, why is it so impossible for John Kerry to accept the same idea and for mainstream media to echo the same ideas? How can it be we have a Secretary of State of the United States who blames the rise of ISIS on apartment building in Jerusalem, in effect? It seems insane. And I would submit that the core reason is very similar to the excellent explanation that my friend John Podhoretz gave at the beginning of the evening, is we live in a morally relativistic culture increasingly. The only exception to that is people who want to assert the existence of good and evil in the world. If you deny that evil exists, and Alan Bloom wrote 20 years ago a compelling look at the fact that for modern thinkers, enlightened thinkers, people in colleges and people in the media, the only intolerable behavior is lack of tolerance. Everything must be tolerated. Everything is equally valid. One point of view is every bit as good as another. one of the things that is going to be necessary to redeem this country, and this actually involves every issue that we face, not just in foreign policy but in domestic policy, is understanding that absolutes exist. There are standards. There is good and there is evil. The United States of America is profoundly good. It doesn't mean we're perfect, but it means we are good. The people who wish to destroy the United States by trying to extinguish the greatest light in the history of planet Earth are evil. And if we can affirm that confidence in our mission, in who we are, in what we do, we can become and continue to be the greatest nation on God's green earth. Thank you very much. Look forward to talking with you and signing books in the lobby.